Oh, I like Psycho. Psych.
Oppan Gangnam Style.
Oppan Gangnam Style.
What language is that, Korean or Japanese?
Oppan Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style. Oppan Gangnam Style.
Oppan Gangnam Style.
And I'm going to introduce the first speaker, who is Mark. Mark has lived in Korea and written about its popular culture since 1996. He was a Korea correspondent for The Hollywood Reporter, Billboard, and other publications. In 2008, he published Pop Goes Korea, a book about the changes and successes Korea has had across its pop culture, from music to TV dramas, films, comic books, and more. He's also produced several documentaries for Discovery Asia about Rain, Lee Byung-hyun, and Kim Yeona. And he will soon have a book coming out about Korean classical rock, folk, classic rock, folk, and pop from the 1960s and 70s. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mark James Russell with a round of applause.
Hi there. All right, thanks a lot everyone for coming. Thanks a lot to the Korean Cultural Center and Mr. Che for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. I have not been in Washington, D.C. since I was a student myself, and that was way too long ago. So, K-pop. Pretty exciting time for Korean popular music. We have a Korean act coming out of nowhere. That's a viral, social media sensation. It takes off, everyone's talking about it, becomes a huge hit, shocks all of the kind of the usual tastemakers, the usual smart guys. And of course, I'm talking about Busker Busker. Busker? You were thinking of someone else? Busker Busker, band from Cheonan, just outside of Seoul in South Korea. They got put on one of those American Idol-style talent shows in Korea, Superstar K3. And they were supposed to be just kind of early round fodder. Get on, get voted off, thank you, bye-bye. But then there was something happened. I mean, they were voted off, but another band had to leave, and they came back. And all of a sudden, people really started liking them. And the producers, the producers aren't really ready for this band. They want other bands featured. But Busker Busker keeps winning their little competitions that they have. And they go deeper and deeper into the show. And they make it all the way to second. Not quite first, but pretty good. And they release an album in March, I think it was. And it's been one of the biggest sellers of the year in Korea. Really fun band. And that's kind of, the power of social media and the internet now in Korea. But maybe you were thinking of someone else. So in mid-August, I get a very nice email from the organizers of this event asking if I wanted to come to speak. And I'm thinking, yeah, K-pop's making some noise these days. It's doing a bit better. This song had already attracted some attention. And it came out in July in Korea, and in Korea it was a hit right away. But a lot of Psy songs are a hit in Korea. He's been popular there a long time. But this video was getting some noise, on the internet. It was on Reddit on July 28th. Rapper T-Pain mentioned it. It was on Gawker. And when I was contacted to speak here, it had maybe 30 or 40 million YouTube views. I'm thinking, okay, it's kind of a thing. That's kind of neat. Maybe I should talk about that a bit. And yeah, 432, well, that's a week old. Does anyone know what he's up to now? 470? Yeah, it's a lot. So it's, last I checked, I think it's around like the 9th most popular YouTube video of all time. So we have something happening in Korea, we have something happening outside of Korea, and kind of related. I mean, the power of social media and K-pop today. Before I get going too far, because I don't want to bore you with stuff you all know, just a quick show of hands. How many people knew anything about K-pop before Psy came along? All right, so I'm preaching to the converted. How many people listened to K-pop or like K-pop, say, more than 3 years ago? Still most of you. How many people have been to a K-pop concert? Yeah, of course. In the United States? Yeah? All right, that's dedication. I'm told those tickets are really hard to get. So yeah, K-pop. Really high energy, fun pop music form coming out of Korea. A lot of dancing, a lot of flashy clothes, usually young, very attractive singers, or close. And it's been a thing for a while. It's, in the 90s, you had Sateji and H.O.T. and, Dongban Shingi, and it's moved into modern times. But Korean music has a bigger history than that. So I'm going to go back a bit and then move up to K-pop. So, even hundreds of years ago, when Chinese diplomats, come to Korea and they go back to China, and they'd be like, wow, those Koreans are really into music. They're just musical people. So it's had a reputation for this for a long time. And then in the 19th century, pretty late, like 70s, 80s, 90s, Western diplomats and missionaries and businessmen start coming into Korea. And they start bringing Western musical modes. And they, in the Japanese colonial period, brings in some Japanese influences. You have jazz, American jazz and American standard pop come in, and it creates this new form of music. It's kind of all of these things mixed together. It's a bit like, it became trot later on, what you might know as enka, or the music you hear in a taxi in Korea, and the music your grandparents listen to. I'm not sure, but it was a thing, right? And from that, this is Lee Nan-young, who was a very popular singer from the 30s. She had a song called The Tears of Mokpo, which is a great song. And if you go to Mokpo now, you climb the mountain and it's playing on a radio nonstop. It drives you nuts. But back then in the 30s, 1939, you had a girl supergroup. It was called the Jogori Sisters. And it was Lee Nan-young and Iwa Ja and Park Hyang-nim. Three of the big sisters then, three big singers then, formed a group. And they were a big hit. Sadly, none of the recordings have come down to us, but it was kind of an early example of what was happening. And then, luckily the Japanese move out, and then the terrible, the war happens. That's really bad. But in the aftermath of the war, you have a large foreign troop presence in Korea, and they need entertainment. And so people in Korea start performing for them. They get together and they try to do American-style pop music of the day. One of the earliest and most popular examples were the Kim sisters, who were actually the daughters of Lee Nan-young. Well, officially they were daughters. It was really like two daughters and a cousin or something. But we're talking, it's mostly American standard pop. And they do the music and the instruments, and they did really well. In fact, they did so well, they were scouted, and they were brought over to Las Vegas in 1959. And the show in Vegas did so well, within months, they were brought on the Ed Sullivan Show, which, in America at the time, that was the show. That's where the Beatles made their big debut. And they were one of the most popular acts ever on the Ed Sullivan Show. They were on like 20 or 30 times. And they had 1 or 2 Billboard hits. I think they made it up to number 6 with their version of Charlie Brown. So it was kind of it was a good thing. But, up until, mid-60s, we're still talking mostly trot music and American, like pop ballads, music like that. But gradually, because of these, all these groups that are forming, American Western rock music, folk music is beginning to come into Korea. You have like 3 different guys who claim to be the Elvis Presley of Korea. People are doing surf rock. People are trying different things, but it's not really clicking in. But the big change comes in 1968 when we have the Pearl Sisters on the top left there. Shin Jung-hyun, who had been playing for the different army bases since the late 50s, he wrote a bunch of songs for them. And this album was a really, really big deal, especially the song One Cup of Coffee. So they become big, and then Shin Jung-hyun discovers all these other talents, and he starts recording himself, and this whole wave of Western music becomes a big deal in Korea. You also have the start of kind of idol-style singers and groups. Kim Se-won, on the top right there, he is famous for his pretty looks there. You can tell. I'm sure you're swooning in your seats. And then later in the 70s, you had the He Sisters. And the He Sisters were getting much closer to K-pop now because the He Sisters were as well known for their looks and their dance moves as they were for their music. And it's some pretty good disco, actually. So, we're moving closer to K-pop, but it's still not quite there. It's a bit syrupy, a bit, people haven't quite unlocked the magic thing yet. So we kind of bumble our way through the 80s, and eventually we get to Sateji. I have a music producer friend. He always says in Korea, there's before Sateji and after Sateji. It changed everything. It blows up huge. And I mean, people had rap before, but not like him, and the dance moves and the high energy, and it's really exciting. In fact, when I was living in the western part of Seoul, in Yeonidong, where he had once lived, I was living there in the late 90s, so his family and Sateji had moved out a long time ago, but still, people were going to his house, and they were spray painting his old house. With Sateji, we love you, Sateji forever. So I'm sure the people that lived there after were very appreciative of that. So it's this magic thing, but that's, industry isn't built on magic. It's not built on, lightning. You have to bottle it. You have to do something with it. You have to regularize it. You have to be able to keep putting out hits. And that's what brings us to Lee Soo-man. Lee Soo-man himself had been a singer in the 70s. He was in a group for a while, April and May. Wait, someone. He did some of his own things. He was on TV, but it wasn't a great time in Korea for a lot of artists. The government of the day wasn't very happy with rock music, and he decided to leave, and he went to America to work on engineering. He got his master's degree in engineering in California. But while he's in America, he discovers MTV. Michael Jackson, music videos, and he's like, yeah, like that. So he comes back to Korea, and that's kind of his model now. He wants to have, that style, that energy. And he tries a couple acts, they don't quite work so well, but then Sateji really that's the formula. So Lee Soo-man figures out that I'm going to do Sateji-style acts with, singers I've discovered, and I'm going to teach them how to, dance and present themselves, and to behave, because he had some problems with his old singers. Some of them got in trouble with the law, and that's not good for your career. So he puts it all together, and he forms HOT. And if you were living in Korea in 96, 97, you're probably like me, you probably still have candy rattling around in your brain. Once that song goes in, it never comes out again. And that really works. And so from there, he starts doing other bands, right? He does SES and all these other great acts. And he's not the only one. Other people are also trying to figure out how to make the magic work and become music moguls and be successful. And so it's this whole scene that's happening. And it's a really creative time in general in Korea. It's after the Olympics. And so you have all these new influences. Korea's more democratic than it's ever been, and it's moving in that direction. It's more rich than it's ever been. It's a great time for TV dramas and movies and everything. And music as well is really flourishing. So you have this K-pop thing that's people have basically figured out how to do really popular stuff, but it's still just in Korea. How do you go out of Korea? A lot of countries have, Japan has had J-pop for a long time, and every country has its domestic music scene. But it takes more than that. And so you also have a technological element affecting things. You have big changes to how we consume music and think about music. What do you think is probably the most important element that takes K-pop to the next level, the technological change? Internet is one, sure, that's a really big one. YouTube later. You know, you have CDs, and then there's all these different things. But in my mind, the most important technological change, do you even know what that is anymore? That's a cable TV box for my day. I mean, they're very pretty now and all fancy. Back then, it was click, click. Yeah. You had to adjust the knob up and down, so like 30 stations. But at the time, you know, now you go 30 stations, but you know, when I was 10 or 12, it's like 30 stations. So in the 90s, you have the rise of cable TV all over Asia. And that's really changing things. Before, in most countries, you'd have like 2 channels or 3 channels, probably state-sponsored, not a lot of airtime, not a lot of freedom. But with cable, you suddenly open it up and you have 30 channels, 40. It's always getting bigger and bigger and more and more. And so, you know, in Taiwan and Singapore and all over, people are trying to fill up this empty space. And they discover you can't only fill it up with American shows. There's a limit to how much Friends people will watch in a day. And they tried. I mean, they tried doing 24 hours, Sex and the City and CSI and X-Files. But American shows are expensive. And to be honest, sometimes American culture for like the average person in other parts of the world, it's not a perfect fit. So out of desperation, and you can't just move to Japanese shows, because for some reason, even though the Japanese programming isn't as famous as American, the Japanese TV stations tried charging nearly as much money. So that's no good. So that's when the Korean cable guys stepped in. The Korean TV drama guys stepped in. And so gradually, the guys who make and produce these Korean dramas, they start going to the TV markets and they start trying to sell these shows. And at first, it's a really tough slog. You know, they're in the basement in the back thing, you know, where the dirty movie guys are. There's no interest. But year by year, it gets a little better. And so, yeah, Taiwan airs some shows, Thailand airs some shows, and people like this because TV's different, fundamentally different than a CD or a movie or most other forms of culture. If you go to a movie, you're going because you think you should spend your money. You already think, well, this is, what is it, $10? Whatever. It's this $5 or $10 worth of fun. I'm going to try this out. And maybe you're disappointed, but you've already made that decision. With CDs as well, you're deciding to spend that money. But with TV, you just sit on your butt. It's great. It's like, hey, what's this? And so people get accustomed to the Korean TV shows, and they like them. And the ratings go up and up. And then in 2002, we get Winter Sonata. Huge. If you were living in Asia at the time, it was unbelievable how big this was. And you could see it just spread around. You know, it airs in one country, and all of a sudden it's like, and then it goes to Japan, and you're getting these tours, and it's huge. And then Jewel in the Palace, Daejangum, in 2004, also huge. And it kept growing at levels you'd never expect. Like a couple years after that, in 2007, I got an email, someone I never met before from Egypt, saying, oh, I love Winter Sonata. I saw it on your blog, and I just, And it just kept moving around. And so, to my mind, TV is kind of the gateway drug to suck people in. Because anyone can watch it, it doesn't cost you anything, and once you have that taste, it gets interesting. Now, at the time, you also have, while TV and movies in Korea are shooting up, the internet's hitting, and music's plummeting. And it really plummets hard in Korea. Korea made this huge, huge broadband shift around 2000. Everyone had broadband. And as soon as everyone had broadband, no one bought CDs. I think in the late 90s, in an average year, Koreans spent about $350 million on CDs and tapes and things. And within a few years, it was like 80 million. And it got low, it's lower now. But, so all these music guys are like, ugh, we got to figure this out. What are we going to do? So they get creative. They try to find different ways of making money with K-pop. One solution is to combine the two. You know, it's Rain in Full House. You get your singers and you put them in a TV show. So, you know, Rain's first album did okay, but around the time of the third album, I believe, is when he did Full House, and Full House becomes an Asia-wide hit. And everything about his career just takes off after that. Really, really big. So that's one thing that's happening. You're having some multimedia stuff, you have advertising, and even though like iTunes still isn't in Korea, but the music industry figured out other ways of selling things digitally, you know, for blogs and for other sources. And by 2004, people in Korea are spending more money on digital downloads and other forms of like online music than they were on physical music. And it's gone more and more in that direction since. So you have a whole new business model that starts in Korea. Very, very linked into social media, very internet savvy, because in Korea, of course, you have Cyworld. Years before Facebook, they have their own social media thing that everyone had. So you have, yes, you're going to see someone later. So basically what you have now in Korea is you have these people who've kind of put together all these different elements. You have the music history, but you have the international side of things. Because from the beginning, from the 90s when these companies were first starting, the music moguls, like Park Jin-young there, they go, Korea's just not big enough. It's not enough to be the king of Korea. I can't have a successful business in a market that small. I need to be abroad. So they're looking at getting into Japan, looking at getting into China, South Asia, the United States, Europe. They're always looking to go abroad. And a lot of the Korean media has been like that. TV, movies, they've always wanted to find success abroad just because they felt like they're too small of a market. So today we generally talk about the big three. Right? We have SM Entertainment, which is Lee Soo-man's company. I'm happy, no balloons tonight, so I don't know who is fans of what group. So we have Lee Soo-man and SM Entertainment. We have Park Jin-young and JYP Entertainment with the Wonder Girls and 2PM and all those bands. And then a YG Family, which was founded by Yang Young-suk, who was one of the dancers in Sotaeji from before. And he has kind of maybe the more edgy, more glammy style of music. And there's other people, but they're the main ones we talk about. And I guess that's kind of the key to my mind, of what K-pop is. It's this combination of a natural love of music that Korea has, combined with these modern elements coming in, but also the desire to go out. And so now, Rain, of course, had his famous dance-off with Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Show a few years ago. We have the Girls' Generation on David Letterman. We have Psy. And we have all these terms now that we're dealing with. People now know what oppa is, who've never studied Korean. And I guess when it comes to K-pop, the other important thing they now know is, what's that other term? Fan service? So, thank you.